Radio Sputnik.
The United States is exploiting Islamic State terrorists to destabilize the region. This is what former Afghanistan's President Hamid Karzai told RT news agency on Wednesday. The former Afghan leader pointed out that a lot of evidence suggested that extremist forces were supplied from the foreign bases within Afghanistan. He referred to multiple reports about unmarked foreign helicopters that, quote, support extremists in all parts of the country. According to Mr. Karzai, the fact that these reports continue proves that terrorists are being used as a tool. He noted that the US had already established itself in Afghanistan. The former Afghan leader believes that the US objectives lie beyond Afghanistan and aim to cause trouble in the region. Hamid Karzai urged the world community to persuade the United States to join the international efforts to fight terror.
And to discuss this in further depth, we're joined live by the Director of Geopolitical Research Project for Command 11, Shahid Raza. Very good afternoon to you, Mr. Raza. Welcome to Radio Sputnik.
Good to be back, Jason.
Great stuff. First question, could you please share with our audience, Shahid, your thoughts about Mr. Karzai's comments? And to what extent does Mr. Karzai's view correspond to reality, do you think?
Look, I, being a very keen observer of Afghanistan affairs, did not find myself particularly surprised by the rather bold stance adopted by the former President Karzai, because all of the issues he outlined during his interview with the RT have been a subject of heated discussions here in Pakistan, both publicly and behind closed doors. The only difference I see here is that now that President Karzai is out of office and probably out of politics as well, and no longer feels obligated to the American dictation, he is simply reinforcing the very well-established narrative among the intelligentsia in Central and South Asian region. So, in my view, Mr. Karzai, being the former president of Afghanistan, is lending credibility to the existing counter-narrative to the continued occupation of Afghanistan by the United States.
Mr. Karzai said that the US does not need a reason to establish in Afghanistan, for it must be for objectives beyond Afghanistan. Perhaps you could just explain to our listeners why that is the case, and what's your take on that?
Look, I have stated this a number of times on Sputnik Radio that the real strategic rationale behind the continued US occupation of Afghanistan has nothing to do with Afghanistan itself. It is squarely aimed at thwarting the multipolarity-inspired world order currently being developed by the regional powers like China, Russia, Pakistan, Iran, and to some extent Turkey. If we look at the history, we hardly see this level of multilateral cooperation in the Eurasian region designed to achieve a common objective under the ambit of initiatives like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or One Belt, One Road initiative. The United States feels particularly threatened by this quantum shift in the geopolitical landscape, and Afghanistan, in my mind, is just a convenient and strategically pivotal piece of geography for the U.S. establishment to try and sabotage this geopolitical alignment. And lastly, if the Americans could get their hands on the Afghan minerals and the skyrocketing narcotics trade worth billions and billions of dollars, all the better for them. It liberates the U.S. establishment from seeking taxpayer funding because they would have an alternative financing available to fuel their perpetual hybrid war against the Eurasian states.
So it's all about retaining the status quo by the sounds of things, Shahid. How do you expect the international community to react to Mr. Karzai's call to influence US policies in Afghanistan? And how would you prefer world leaders to react to his call?
Look, in my point of view, the US is not in Afghanistan looking for a solution. Their intention should have been clear to the regional powers that are being adversely affected by this war. By now, the only credible solution to Afghanistan is to seek an Afghan-owned and led national reconciliation process to absorb the Afghan Taliban into the Afghan polity. And I'm sure that the four regional powers, namely China, Russia, Pakistan, Iran, would support such a long-lasting solution. And because it supports their interests, and the U.S. establishment actually benefits from the manageable instability in Afghanistan because it justifies their continued occupation of the country. So when President Karzai talks about the unmarked helicopters aiding ISIS operatives in Afghanistan, to me, it makes complete sense, because despite what the U.S. says in public, the ISIS operations are actually helping to sustain their strategic objectives, not just in Afghanistan, but also across the region. And look, I doubt that the international community has any appetite left in Afghanistan affairs, because, frankly speaking, to the U.S. allies, Afghanistan means nothing in measurable economic or strategic metrics. And their total indifference to Afghanistan post the 2014 withdrawal is actually helping the U.S. establishment, because there's little pressure on them to change their policies in the country. In my opinion, Afghanistan is now an open field for the U.S., and there is very little any other country, especially the U.S. allies, can do to stop this. However, I do suggest a pragmatic option, which would be for the regional powers, like, namely China, Russia, Pakistan, and Iran, to create a quadrilateral mechanism to build diplomatic pressure on the United States to accept a broad spectrum Afghan reconciliation process, rather than choosing to become the regional hegemon. So in my analysis, the onus is on the regional countries to take the coordinated diplomatic initiative with the U.S., especially at the forums like the United Nations, where the stakeholding countries should express open opposition to the U.S. ambitions in Afghanistan.
Just a final question for you, Shahid. It's been interesting listening to you this afternoon. What's your particular thoughts about Washington's policies regarding Afghanistan? Is it just propaganda, and how would you, as a director of geopolitical research, in terms of your embedded experience in the region, what would you like to be seen to be done now moving forward to get things really moving and get some harmony globally and internationally between all parties?
Look, I don't believe that the situation in Afghanistan is headed for a solution, because the Trump administration, I'm not sure what their real policies are. They're looking for an escalation. And Washington has helped in Afghanistan. It has enabled the Indian deep state to wage a bloody hybrid war against Pakistan through the Afghan territory. In return, it expects India to counterbalance the regional countries by activating their international borders and to create further instability, which manifests in the Indian shelling into Pakistan and also the recent showdown with China in Doklam. So India is pitching itself to the U.S. as a regional, reliable ally to thwart the multipolar geopolitical project. India acts as a subcontractor to Afghanistan to supply ISIS, other terrorist organizations like ETIM, which pose a threat to China, Russia, Pakistan, Iran. And this cloak and dagger strategy by the U.S. and its ally India is feeding into the manageable instability paradigm in Afghanistan. So in my mind, unless there is a counter-block approach to tackle this situation, which I mentioned earlier, that the regional countries should get together, they should team up, and they should go to all international forums, especially the United Nations, and not just the United Nations, but also the United Nations Security Council. Two of those countries are veto powers, Russia and China. They should openly express opposition to the continued occupation of Afghanistan. There should be measurable goals. There should be deadlines set. The warring parties should be invited. There should be a reconciliation process. It should be supervised by the United Nations. And the regional countries have a right to protect their interests, especially when the strategic understanding in the region is that the U.S. is here to destabilize the region and to stop these countries from integrating with each other and creating a multipolar geopolitical order. So I believe that the situation in Afghanistan will only get worse unless the regional countries actually up their game and they take it to an international level and they find a solution, and that solution is ratified by the international community.